Now, in filming this scene, again, from reading the account or the description that Louise Brooks gives in the chapter in Lulu in Hollywood, where she talks about working with Pabst and the filming of this movie, she describes even imitates his German accent and says that he said to her, "Louise, you must wear the ugly robe and be naked underneath." And this is after she came out of the dressing room wearing I think she describes something like a sexy little yellow nightie, which showed probably a lot more skin and looked a lot prettier than what she wears in this scene. But she says that Pabst wanted her to wear the ugly robe and be naked underneath, and she asked him what purpose would this serve, and he pointed to the actor that plays Alva and says, "Because he will know that you are naked underneath." And so again, it was that Pabst was looking for realism. He wanted the right reactions from his actors. So she did the scene the way he wanted. But now, when I watch this scene, that's the first thing I think of now is her description of filming of this movie. Again, this shows the genius of Pabst at working with actors, where I read somewhere that Stanley Kubrick, in order to get the right performances, or what he thought was imagined as the right performances from his actors, he would make them shoot the same scene up to 100 times, I think in one case, until the actors got it right, whereas Pabst would get his scenes in often 1 or 2 takes, because he, again, was a genius at engineering reactions and knowing how to produce the right reactions that he wanted from his actors. Pabst had, I think, more than an amateur's knowledge of human psychology, and that was the secret of his success working with actors. Instead of trying to manipulate them or threaten them into getting the performance that he wanted, what he would do is he would figure out, usually very quickly, so that he only had to shoot his scenes each with only a very few takes, what he could do to produce the real emotion in the actors that he wanted to come out in the scene, and then he would create that circumstance as they were filming. So the reactions on the faces of the actors are often real emotion, not fake and not simulated. Stanley Kubrick, though, is probably one of my favorite directors of him, and he was a genius at inserting hidden messages into his films and communicating what almost seems to be like subliminal messages through the use of carefully hidden symbols. There's very little of that here, although I will say that Pabst does some very effective, subtle suggestions. Another thing that Louise describes, I think it's in this same chapter, probably not long after she describes filming this scene, is she explains that 20 years after its release, movies became popular, and she said a Catholic priest of all people recognized her, because 20 years after this film, she actually looked almost exactly the same as when she played Lulu, except for her hairstyle. Anyway, the priest realized she had played Lulu in this film, and so he asked her, how could she dare play such a woman, such a character in this film? And the first thing I think of this is that the way she describes this priest is that he seems so puffed up with self-righteousness and pride that it makes me suspect that probably maybe 2 hours before he's accusing Louise Brooks, or he probably himself was sucking on some altar boy's toes and then probably ejaculated on his naked backside before he sanctimoniously asked Louise Brooks how could she dare play such a character, and Louise Brooks explained that when she was a chorus girl on the Ziegfeld show, she actually shared the stage with and knew several real Lulus that certain rich men were keeping as mistresses who had probably done quite a few of the similar things that this character does in this film. So for her, she was just imitating real life. First of all, I disagree with the priest's impression that Lulu is the least moral out of all these characters in the film, where again I see, as you compare the pimp, the little pimp, the doctor, and several of these other characters that appear later in the film, And one, especially one that it would be a big spoiler because the surprise hasn't happened yet, so I can't mention him. But again, I would say that Lulu here is far from the worst of these characters. But again, it's the bias of Western society that because she is a mistress or was a prostitute, that she is the ultimate evil or the corrupter of all of them. Where again, this film, when you watch this film, that's definitely not the case. The other thing I think is it's a vast difference to, let's say, play Hitler in a film compared to doing those actual things in real life. And this film, it has some really important things to say about our illusions of morality. And so, again, I don't think the priest's criticisms are valid. Also, keep in mind when you're thinking about passing a judgment on this character that Lulu's morality was formed, unfortunately, at an early age when she began being pimped out as probably a young teenager. Now, basically, from this point on, the film becomes like a melodrama, almost like modern scripted TV reality shows. It's almost like an episode of Desperate Housewives of New York, where Audrina has to get a secret abortion, and then the next scene shows us Mike Tyson standing on his lawn with his shirt off and his heavyweight belt strapped around his waist, and with cocaine all over his face and his tiger cubs by his side, shouting, "I can't stop! I love the cocaine!" Not in the slightest suggesting that some of the bad things that Lulu does in this film are right, but I am saying that we should keep in mind that Lulu has a valid reason for why she is the way she is. She was probably used by every predator from a very young age, so we shouldn't expect her to be different than she is. Life has taught her that she has sex as a commodity that she has to use to survive. These other characters have a lot less excuses for their actions, especially in using her. Because some of them they claim to be better than her, but again, this is based on an illusion, and it's based on relative morality and relative circumstances, which are oftentimes out of our own control. None of us get to choose in life whether we are born into a good family or a bad family. And though we like to deceive ourselves and say otherwise, the reality is that everyone doesn't have the same opportunities in life. Lulu has learned her morality, or her version of morality, from a street pimp, so we shouldn't expect her to be any different than how she is. Even if the film isn't as obvious about this statement as maybe even I think it should be, I think the question I'm asking in bringing up some of these statements about morality that's shown in this film is, why is it considered perfectly moral and respectable for someone, a rich man like Dr. Schoen, to use and then discard Lulu as he was planning to do had the circumstances gone his way? And as for the Catholic priest, especially his self-righteousness as he condemned Louise Brooks, he should realize that in the 600 years of the Inquisition, the Catholic Church may in fact have killed almost as many Jews as Hitler during the Holocaust. The other thing this scene with Lulu and the robe makes me think of is that Pabst wanting Lulu to be naked under the robe. During the time that Louise Brooks had filed for bankruptcy when her acting career stopped and she had to go back to dancing in clubs, she also posed for a number of nude photographs. And this makes me suspect, I think, had a film that she worked on been in something like, let's say, some kind of an art film where the script required nudity, and most of the films that Louise Brooks made are all pre-code, so nudity was in films prior to 1934, just no one ever asked her to do it. I tend to think she might have actually done a nude scene if asked to do one. And having seen the photographs of her, she was an all-over beautiful woman, so there wouldn't have been any problem with her not looking good in the film. Louise Brooks, in my opinion, is the first really modern actress, and she doesn't get enough credit in the history books for her talent. And by this I mean, in this time, the film industry was transitioning from silent films to sound films, and Louise Brooks was the first actress to figure out that all the exaggerated gestures and physical acting that the previous actresses had been doing in the silent movies was now unnecessary, because all films would use close-ups and microphones. So now this required a lot more subtle type of more realistic acting. And she is the first actress to act in this style and doesn't get any credit for it, because now all modern film actresses in essence all imitate her. And anybody, I don't accept any condemnation or any so-called moral judgments from any members of the Catholic Church hierarchy, because these are the people who gave us the Inquisition, residential schools, the Magdalene laundries, and countless other atrocities in history. So if anything, and besides molesting altar boys, if anything, the Catholic priest should just shut his mouth before he condemns anyone. I've read the Catholic Book of Canon Law, and there's some horrific so-called laws which are a perfect example of the identical rhetoric that cult leaders use to control their followers. That is supposedly the justification for why popes and priests can abuse anyone that they want. A mere 2 or 3 years before the priest confronted and judged Louise Brooks, Catholic priests in Croatia were slaughtering 900,000 Orthodox Serbs because they wouldn't convert to Catholicism. I wish someone standing nearby, that Catholic priest, he's dead now, who tried confronting Louise Brooks and condemn her and tell him to shut the F up. For 200 years in the Magdalene laundries, Catholic nuns used to punish women who were so-called prostitutes. I think the Magdalene laundries example is especially applicable here because it's very, very similar to the priest's judgmental attitude towards Lulu and Louise Brooks. And maybe had the so-called immoral women in the Magdalene laundries been in fact altar boys, they would have been then good enough for the priests to use to gratify themselves and their sexual desires on them. So I think the priest's condemnation of Louise Brooks really gets to the heart of the moral issue here that I think is shown in this film, and that is from the bias of the playwright, and again, as I've said before, most of the audience, it's okay for someone to abuse a naughty girl and still call themselves a moral person, as if there is levels of morality and there's people at the top or higher up in society are allowed to punish those at the bottom because they're deserving. And I think that of a subtle message or the play and this film plays on that belief, because it's, again, the playwright sees it as okay for Dr. Schoen to say use and discard Lulu because she's a naughty girl. But what she does, he considers as immorality. And I think this is, again, based on personal preferences and a false illusion of morality, because the real truth is, if you believe in any kind of absolute truth, then there can only be one standard of morality for everybody, not a different one depending on how much money you have or what social class or how much power in society you occupy. The fact that these other characters are doing in essence the same thing that Lulu is doing shows in essence that their claims of being better or morally superior are a complete lie. I also find it at least a little curious that the Catholic Church is so preoccupied with punishing so-called immoral women, because it in fact is the harlot of Babylon in Revelation chapter 17. So again, it's total hypocrisy that the mother of all harlots has to find every single little instance of so-called immorality and make these insignificant little women suffer for it. I think this actually shows the human propensity for cruelty, not morality, because we in essence love to cruelly and severely punish others for doing the same sins that we do. Catholic Church is especially one of the worst examples in history of this feature of humanity. Catholic Church seems to have the mistaken assumption that it's their job to enforce everyone's morality, yet it can't follow the slightest moral rules itself, as we're finding people who are so low in status that they can't kick back, and punishing them for all of our sins and transgressions. And again, just because this is human nature and it comes naturally to us to do so, it doesn't make it right, and it's not morality. It just shows that we believe that whoever somehow, by whatever means necessary, climbs over people and scrapes his way to the top of the pyramid now becomes entitled to make everyone beneath him suffer. And that again, this probably is our reason for climbing the pyramid, is to punish everyone below.